Hi, I'm Bruce Pattinson, talking to you from Total Education Centre. We're here today to continue our series of lectures on Jane Eyre. Today I'd like to talk to you about the setting of Jane Eyre and how it affects the narrative and some of the ideas. It's very important to remember that these lectures are supplementary to the notes that are available on our website. So if you want to go extra and additional help, go to totaleducation.com.au and you'll find those notes there. Don't forget also, if you like this lecture and it's very helpful, could you press the like button down below. If you have any questions at all or any comments, please leave them in the comments box and ask a question. We'll certainly get back to you, and we take all questions very seriously. We like to hear from you. It gives us an idea of what you like. Also, if you have any ideas for lectures or additional lectures on Jane Eyre especially, please let us know. So today I'd like to talk about setting in particular. Now there are 5 very specific settings in Jane Eyre. The first one is Gateshead Hall, then we go to Lowood School, then Thornfield Hall, Moor House and Ferndean Manor. And we go to those 5 very particular settings, and in each one Jane learns something, develops somehow, progresses somehow. The first setting, Gateshead Hall, she has very little choice about where she goes. She's taken in by that family, and in particular what we find is that she's very, very unhappy here. Remember, it's here she gets locked in the red room. Here she learns to be by herself, and she adapts different tactics to survive against the bullying. And in particular, you'll note the red room is very, very, very important. Here she's locked away, here she gets time to think, here she gets time to cool down. And it's very influential on what happens to her in the rest of the novel. She's not happy at Gateshead Hall, and I'll just read you one very short quote. She says, "I was a discord in Gateshead Hall. I was like a nobody there. I had nothing in harmony with Mrs. Reed or her children or her close vassalage. If they did not love me, in fact, as little did I love them. They were not bound to regard me with affection, a thing that could not sympathise with one among them, a heterogeneous thing, opposed to them in temperament, incapacity, impropensities, a useless thing, incapable of serving interest or adding to their pleasure, a noxious thing." And it goes on in those particular ways. We see that Jane's very, very unhappy at Gateshead Hall and takes the first opportunity to leave. She certainly has a very difficult time there. She's bullied. They're a very inappropriate family for her. After the death of Mr. Reed, who was the one who actually wanted her there and makes the wife promise to take Jane in, that she has a most unhappy life. But it's formative and it shapes her. She realises there that she has strength. She confronts at one point Mrs. Reed and feels that she's won that battle so much, and she speaks out very clearly about what's happening and how it's happening in their home. And she makes herself feel a little bit stronger and a little bit more independent. She certainly learns to tackle strong male figures head on, and this serves her very usefully at the end of the novel. John Reed in fact bullies her mercilessly and physically even, and he's very cruel to her, and she learns ways of standing up to this and or avoiding it. And here the use of silence is very important. We'll talk about that in another lecture when we discuss technique. So Gateshead Hill is very formative yet unhappy, and it sets the tone for the novel in that Jane Eyre suffers in some sort of way, comes through it, becomes a better person. And that theme is repeated constantly in each of these different settings. The next setting, of course, is Lowood School, and here we find that Jane is just as unhappy as she was back at Gateshead Hill, but learns something different here, and in the end it comes through and actually likes the place. It's here she makes her first friend in many ways, Helen Burns, although as we know Helen dies and was a model for Charlotte Bronte's sister. The fact that she actually makes a friend here and has a friend for the very first time is very important. The early days at Lowood School are a definite struggle for her, and she struggles to adapt not only to the regiment and discipline, but she's also certainly bullied, again by Mr. Brocklehurst. You remember the incident where he makes a stand on a chair in front of the whole school and calls her a liar. Again, she comes through against this strong male figure, And in the end, she seemed to win with his demotion, I suppose you'd call it, his loss of activity and faith in the school, and that it's taken over and it's run in a much more manageable and meaningful way. She says, of course, sorry, at the start of chapter 7, my first quarter at Lowood seemed an age, and not the golden age either. It comprised an irksome struggle with the difficulties in habituating myself to the new rules and unwanted tasks. The fear of failure in these points harassed me worse than the physical hardships of my lot, though these were no trifles. And so Jane not only struggles mentally, but struggles physically with the problems that she suffers at Lowood. And we know that the conditions there are extremely harsh, and they're not changed until all the deaths occur. And that then Jane moves on and becomes a tutor, and she learns a lot. She gets a good education at the school. She makes some very close female figure friends that strengthen her and show her the way. And she learns enough to become well enough educated to certainly move on to a new position, and that's at Thornfield Hall. And it's at Thornfield Hall, of course, where she spends most of the middle section of the novel. It's here that she becomes the governess for Rochester, as not daughter, I suppose, perhaps daughter, from a previous affair, and that she falls in love with him. And of course this is the romance part of the epic, and Thornfield is certainly where most of the romance and the mystery around the romance. We learn later, of course, that Rochester's already married and has his wife, Bertha Mason, hidden away, I suppose you'd call it, on the 3rd floor. And there's lots of gothic imagery here, and the supernatural comes into it again at Thornfield Hall with the full moons and places like that. Eventually though, Thornfield Hall, with all its luxury and wealth, becomes a place of foreboding and sadness for Jane. Of course, it's here she returns to after the aborted wedding. It's here that she feels still slightly, not insignificant, but a little less secure with Rochester. He's still, because of his position and it's his place, has the dominant role in their relationship. And when she decides to leave Thornfield Hall after the aborted marriage ceremony, it's a very trying and emotional time for her. And she says at the start of chapter 37, sometime in the afternoon I raised my head, and looking around and seeing the westering sun gilding the sign of its decline on the wall, I asked, what am I to do? But the answer in my mind gave, leave Thornfield Hall at once, was so prompt, so dread, that I stopped in my ears. I could not bear such words now. And she goes on to argue that she doesn't want to leave Thornfield Hall, and she doesn't want to leave Rochester, but for her own sake she must, and of course she does leave Thornfield Hall. We don't return to Thornfield Hall till the end of the novel, but I'd like to talk about the next setting first. Thornfield Hall is where she certainly adapts and moves forward, and the next place, Moor House, is where again she meets a strong male figure in St. John, that makes two very good sisters. We like to think of them later on, or cousins. And in this setting again, she uses her skills and her strength of will and strength of purpose to adapt very clearly to what it is. And she comes across this place in very sort of insignificant circumstances in many ways. The night where she has on the Moor after she leaves Thornfield Hall, after that period I just read you, and when she goes to the Moor House, she's in a very bad way, and it's probably the low point of the nadir of the novel. And it's here that she gets to recuperate in many ways, and it's here she gains that final, I suppose, knowledge. If you think of the novels that Bildungsström or the development of a young person, that is what happens here. And she does that, as I said at the start of this lecture, in the series of those 5 steps. But it's in this step in particular where she really becomes independent in many ways and becomes a leading dominant figure, which was very unusual for those times, and certainly in Victorian England it was most unusual. It's not only here that she breaks out of that cycle in an intellectual, probably, and in a moral way, an ethical way, but she also becomes materially independent as well, with the inheritance from her uncle from the Indies. Now we see that first night when she comes to that gate, she just sees the silhouette of the house and she sort of crumbles on the doorstep and is taken in. And that's very important to her. After this, and she rejects St John, and she goes back because she's now independently wealthy, and she goes back to see what's become of Rochester. She goes back to Thornfield Hall, and she finds it's been destroyed, and she finds that Rochester isn't the man that he used to be. And she looks on the house this way. I looked with timorous joy towards a stately house. I saw a blackened ruin. No need to cower behind a gatepost indeed, to peep up at a chamber, lattices, fearing life was astir beneath them. No need to listen for doors opening, to fancy steps on the pavement or the gravel walk. And then it goes on, and then she says, and there was the silence of death about it, the solitude of a lonesome wild. And the house has been completely destroyed. And thus, the past has been erased, and Bertha's dead, she's died in the fire. And they move on to the final setting of Ferndean, and this is a wild setting, but it makes them both very sane. And we read at the start of chapter 37 about Ferndean. The manor house of Ferndean was a building of considerable antiquity, moderate size and no architectural pretensions, deep buried in the wood. I'd heard of it before. Mr. Rochester often spoke of it and sometimes went there. His father had purchased the estate for the sake of the game covers. He would have let the house but could find no tenant in consequence of its ineligible and insalubrious site. Ferndean then remained uninhabited and unfurnished, and it goes on to talk about why that is a nice new place for both of them to settle. And it's here she shows Rochester that she is independent, they're both equals, they get married, they live happily ever after. In each of those 5 settings, there are very particular things that happen to Jane Eyre, and very, very similar narrative points. You need to focus on the atmosphere of those places, how Charlotte Bronte creates them, and look at each of those things and what she learns. And I've explained that to you a little bit in this lecture. That gives you a sort of general outline of what's happening. Of course, there's more detail in the notes. If you want to get those notes, go to totaleducationcentre.com.au. We hope you enjoyed this lecture. Don't forget, give us a like, leave a comment or a question. Thank you. I'm Bruce Pattinson.